What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some test photos and videos from the OnePlus Nord N20 5G and going over whether or not this phone really has a good enough camera setup for daily use. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about this phone's specs and features, be sure to check out my full review of it on the channel. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now, as always, the first thing I want to go over is the front-facing camera. With this phone, we got a nice looking hole punch design for this camera, and it's up in the top left corner. This is one of the more popular front-facing camera designs, and I really like it. It's kind of out of the way of everything. It really makes the status bar look clean and minimalistic and gives the phone a nice modern feel in general. And this camera is 16 megapixels, so definitely decently powerful too. So this photo was taken with the front-facing camera in a really bright room, so a couple studio lights, a ring light, and a couple daylight lamps on top of that. Now, a couple things to keep in mind here. First of all, this lighting is really bright, as you can probably tell, but at the same time it's also really neutral. So on one hand, it's not cool per se, but it's also not warm like the lights you might find in a living room. So on one hand, I don't think this is realistically the type of lighting most people are going to be taking selfies in, but that being said, I do think it gives us a good idea of how this camera reacts to really bright lighting. In general, it's definitely not bad and the details are especially sharp, but on the other hand, the contrast is a little high and the colors are sort of dull. So if you happen to be taking selfies in a brighter area, definitely keep this in mind. Now here's a photo taken in more normal lighting, pretty much your typical house lights here, and I'm gonna guess most people are probably gonna be taking selfies in a similar lighting to this. The contrast is still a little bit higher than I'd prefer, and the colors still aren't nearly as realistic as a higher end phone, but for what it is, I do think in normal lighting like this, you can get some decent selfies with the OnePlus Nord N20 5G. Now on the complete other end here, here's a photo taken in really low lighting, only one lamp in the room with a pretty warm tone, and this photo surprisingly turned out really well. I think it goes to show that with this selfie camera in particular, the photos for whatever reason are a little bit better in slightly lower lighting. Now I don't mean like in the dark or anything, but I do think with this camera in particular, it's a little bit easier to overdo it on the lighting than it is with other phones. Now of course, the overall experience is probably going to vary a little bit from person to person, but in general, I do think with this camera, once you find your optimal setting for it, again, you can definitely get some good selfies here. Now to add to this point, here's a photo taken in direct sunlight using portrait mode. Again, it doesn't really look bad per se, but the contrast is still a little bit higher than I'd want, and the colors also don't look nearly as good as they would with something like a Samsung Galaxy A series, for example. So overall, if you're taking a lot of selfies but you're not really doing anything important with them, then this phone will at least get the job done. But if you're doing a lot of vlogging or social media or something like that where you really want good quality photos, then I would suggest looking at a different device that has a better front-facing camera. But now that we've gone over the front-facing camera, let's take a look at what we got in the main camera setup. So on the back here, we got a triple camera setup with a 64 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So my biggest complaint about this camera setup is that there's no ultra wide camera, because pretty much every phone this phone competes against has an ultra wide camera, so not having one is a pretty big disadvantage, especially considering how popular the feature is. But aside from that, we do have pretty much everything else here, so let's take a look at what these cameras can do. So here are some photos taken with the main camera in various different settings. Now keep in mind, this is just using the regular main camera, nothing special here, no filters or anything like that. In general, I do think these photos came out really well. The details are nice and sharp, the brightness and colors are pretty realistic, and for the most part, I really have no complaints. Now that being said, while I do think they look really good, these photos are still not at the level of something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra, for example, but seeing that this is a $300 phone we're talking about, it's not really that surprising. So while you're definitely going to want something a little bit higher end for more serious mobile photography, I feel like most of you are probably going to be mostly taking photos for more casual purposes like social media, for example, and when it comes to things like that, this phone will definitely get the job done. Now another thing I want to highlight here is that in lower lighting, this phone really does do a good job. As you can see from these photos taken during this kind of sunset here, of course they're obviously not going to be as good as something like night mode in an iPhone 13 Pro Max, but for a $300 mid-range phone, it really just works. So again, while you're probably not going to be doing serious photography here, if you want to take a picture of a nice sunset or maybe a skyline at night for your Instagram story, for example, this phone will be perfectly fine for things like that. Now one kind of interesting thing you might not know about this phone, or pretty much any Android phone for that matter, is that when you're taking a photo in normal photo mode, you're actually not using the entire power of the camera. Remember, this phone does have a 64 megapixel main camera, and while the photos it does take in normal photo mode are really good, there is a certain setting you can use to make them even better. Now if you want to learn exactly how to do that, I definitely recommend watching my camera tips and tricks video, but let's take a look at what these photos look like when you're using the full power of the camera. So here's some photos taken with the full 64 megapixels of the main camera. Now just so you know, I didn't actually choose to shoot it in 4x3. When you're using the full 64 megapixels, it kind of just makes you do it. I don't really know why. But despite that kind of weirdness when it comes to the aspect ratio, I do think the actual photos look really nice. But that being said, to be perfectly honest, they're only really marginally better than the regular photos. There are some phones out there, like a lot of the mid-range Samsung Galaxy A series phones for example, where the full megapixel mode actually makes a huge difference. But with this phone, it really just kind of doesn't. Again, I don't really think these photos look bad, but keep in mind, compared to regular photos, these photos are more than double the file size, and with such a small improvement in quality, I really just don't think it's worth it. Now moving on, here's some photos taken with the macro camera. Now I don't really have a whole lot to say here. These photos are okay, they're not really the best, but if you're trying to get those close-up detailed images, it will get the job done. Like pretty much every macro camera I've ever used, it doesn't really get the greatest photos in low lighting, but when you get the right lighting, the details do look decently sharp, so I really can't complain. But all that being said, keep in mind there are several phones that are really not that much more expensive than this one, if at all, that take much better photos with their macro cameras. So if this is a feature that's actually important to you, definitely keep this in mind. Just so you can see what I mean, here's a photo taken with the Samsung Galaxy A33 5G, and last time I checked, this phone was pretty much the same price as the OnePlus Nord N20 5G, maybe a little bit more or a little bit less depending on where you get it, and this photo just looks so much better. So again, if the macro camera is really important to you, which I don't really know that it will be that essential for a lot of people, but if it is, definitely keep in mind in this price range, you are going to have plenty of options that are better than this phone. So now that we've gone over the main photo functions of this phone, let's talk about the video quality. So when it comes to video, the actual resolution is kind of disappointing because this phone can only record videos in up to 1080p at 30 frames per second. So not only are we not getting 4K, but we're not even getting a higher frame rate, whereas this phone has plenty of competitors that can record 4K videos, so that is kind of a letdown. But especially when it comes to video, everyone's going to have a slightly different standard on what's actually good and what's not. So let's take a look at a quick video sample. So here's a test video with the OnePlus Nord N20 5G. We are recording in 1080p right now, which is the max quality. Also keep in mind what the audio sounds like. Autofocus is a little slow, but it does work. So despite the whole thing with the resolution, I am actually pretty impressed with this phone's video capabilities. The first thing I noticed right away is the audio quality. Usually with a phone in this price range, the audio is going to be borderline unusable, and while this audio is still not going to be as good as something like an external mic for example, I still do think it's actually pretty usable, especially if you're doing something like vlogging, Instagram stories, where it's kind of expected that you're going to be recording in the moment. I feel like it will definitely work for that. When it comes to the video, again, I am disappointed that you can't record in 4K or a higher frame rate, but aside from that, I do actually think the video quality is pretty good. The stabilization is definitely not bad, so you can get nice B-roll and stuff like that. The clips are pretty smooth in general, and the image itself looks really good too. Of course, the videos you record on this phone are not going to be nearly as good as a $1,400 flagship phone, but for more casual everyday use, it definitely will get the job done. But in conclusion, is the camera setup of the OnePlus Nord N20 5G good enough for daily use? I would definitely say it is. Sure, it doesn't have any special features, and I do think it's really disappointing it doesn't have an ultra-wide camera. The macro camera does leave a little bit to be desired, and like we just talked about, the video mode, while being really good for what it is, still can't record in 4K or 60 frames per second, while plenty of its competitors can. But despite all this, I do think the photos and videos this phone does take, while not being at the level of something like a $1,400 flagship phone for example, are still definitely good enough for the average user. So if you are looking for a phone with a good, strong camera setup that has pretty much all the basics, and you're mostly taking photos for social media and more casual purposes, then the OnePlus Nord N20 5G is going to be a great option. Now if you want to learn more about how to actually use this phone's camera, definitely check out my camera tips and tricks video, which I will be linking to in the video description. I will also be linking to the full review of this phone as well, where you can learn more about the phone's specs and features, and some information about pricing and general availability, because this is always changing. But this concludes my camera review of the OnePlus Nord N20 N25G. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next one.